Okay, shall we begin? Okay. My name is Randy Taylor, Randy G. Taylor. I am 49 years old. I live in Brooklyn, New York. Today is July 13th, 2005, and we are at the Grand Central Terminal, and I'm speaking to Sarah from StoryCorps. And I'm here to tell a story that I feel very compelled to tell. September 11th. I had found my way to what was a heap of wreckage that used to be the Marriott Hotel about an hour after the collapse of the towers. And later on that afternoon, after I'd been there for about 6 hours, roughly 3 in the afternoon, there was beginning to mount a rescue operation or one to look for survivors. And I was standing sort of at the base of this mound, this pile of wreckage, and people were organizing and going up. I was standing next to a guy named James Knockway, who is actually known as one of the most famous photographers in the world, a photojournalist. And the two of us were positioned so we could really clearly see what was about to take place as the rescue workers, the firemen. There was a dog. There were probably 8 or 10 of them, and they were about ready to go up the mound. Out of the wreckage was an I-beam, a steel I-beam that jetted out of the wreckage directly towards us. In fact, we were very, very close to it. Our heads were perhaps a foot or two away from this I-beam. And it was at eye level. So if you could imagine us sort of looking up slightly at the end of this I-beam, and it stuck out of this wreckage like a dagger sticking out of a body. It was quite ominous, and I'm sure that we probably thought that it would make a great foreground for a picture. As the firemen began to gather and go up climb up this mountain, there was one fireman who saw us over here, and he came around and he walked out the I-beam. And this I-beam was about 20 feet long in the air. It was like a balance beam in gymnastics, and he was a very tall fireman. He was slender. He was a little bit on the older side, and he was weary, clearly. He was laden with gear, and he walked out to the end of the I-beam, and he looked down at us, and he asked, "Are you with the press?" And the two of us nodded yes, and then he knelt down on one knee. So we were really looking up at him as he knelt on one knee on this I-beam. And the afternoon sunlight was breaking through the caustic haze, and it was really hitting him square on. And he had a kind of warm glow to him, and we were looking up at him against a hazy blue sky. He had a 2 or 3 days growth of beard on him. It was kind of a little bit gray, but I couldn't tell for sure if that was sort of that he was really older or if it was just this caustic dust that had adhered itself to everything. And he began to speak with us. And he told us that earlier in the day he was inside the tower, and the necessity had come for him to go out to the truck to get something, and he was sent out to the truck to get a piece of equipment or something. He didn't say what it was. And while he was at the truck, the tower collapsed, and it buried all of his colleagues, all of his firemen. They were all under the wreckage, he said, and he proceeded to talk about how this was not going to stop them, that this was merely a moment in time, that the power of the will was going to carry on, that there would be new firemen that were going to take the place of his fallen comrades, that this loss was not in vain, that he would help train the new ones, and that they would go out and they would save lives and they would do their jobs, and that he was the only survivor of his entire truck, that they were all wiped out except for him, except for this fluke where he happened to be sent out to the truck. And of course the blast of the falling debris, the falling building had blown him and the truck kind of clear and caused him to survive. And as he knelt down and he looked us in the eye, and he was not angry, he was more determined. It was more a look of forcefulness and strength. And we looked up to him, and and he told this story, and then he said he would have to resume the search with his others. He had kind of broken away from the group to come down and speak with us. And he looked at us and he asked us if we would tell his story. And I was tongue-tied. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even respond, but Jim was quicker than I, and he said, "Yes, sir, we will do our very best to tell your story." And he stood up, and a towering figure from this angle, and he walked down this I-beam and went up to join his colleagues to resume the search. And I felt I'd kind of, committed to tell his story, and the subtleties of us being photographers versus journalists and not being writers, it was not the moment to convey such things, and yet I felt like I had promised that I would tell this story, and we didn't shoot a single picture of him. It was such a gripping moment that, he came and he told his story and he went, and, the two of us stood there completely dumbfounded, just, not even sure, what had just, it was surreal. The experience was just surreal. There were no survivors found. I thought that there would be somebody found, but they went and they climbed the hill. They had the dog, and they looked around, and ultimately anybody who had survived had already gotten out by that time. And that was the event. For me, the day started much earlier, of course. I had come out of the subway at 23rd Street, where the Flatiron Building is, and ironically, an assistant that works with me in the office, Evan Froelich, had come out of the subway with me. It's very unusual that we arrived together. We had arrived early that day, and lining the street were many people looking at something. And we walked up to somebody and said, "What's everybody looking at?" And they said, "A plane has flown into the World Trade Center." And we turned around, and there was the building, billowing with smoke down Fifth Avenue in the distance. And I, of course, knew immediately that this had to be an attack of some kind. It was a clear blue sky. There was no way that this could have been an accident. And we went up to the office. Years ago, I used to be a photojournalist, and I still had all my cameras. And even though I hadn't done that as a trade for a long time, I was compelled to do it. So I grabbed the cameras and walked out the door. We walked, and we began to walk down Fifth Avenue and photographing what we saw as we went. And there were people lining the streets. There were flags flying down Fifth Avenue with the cloud of smoke billowing in the background. And as we walked further, time progressed, and we got down where the street narrowed past the big square where the little Arc of Triumph is. And at that point, one of the buildings collapsed. And the streets were lined with people watching, and people said, "Awesome, cool, oh wow, did you see that?" There was this reaction of watching a movie. It was a reaction that was disconnected from the reality. And within moments, a pale of silence fell over the street. People began to quickly realize that this was not a movie, that they really had watched the death of what felt like thousands of people right there in front of them. Silence prevailed for a few seconds, and then one person began to cry, and then another person, and the crowd began to break out in tears, and women began to turn into their boyfriends and for solace, and the crowd realized that life had been lost, and we proceeded to walk further down the street. And as we got closer, we saw people huddled around radios and trying to get every bit of information that they could. People had their cameras, and they were taking pictures and video, and people were trying to talk on cell phones, although clearly not many people were getting through on the cell phones. The lines were jammed. We walked further, and we got closer. There was an overpass over one of the streets, and we crossed over it, and I could see the bodies falling from the building. I was thinking that the flames were too hot, and that they were forced to just let go. It hadn't dawned on me that they would just simply jump. But later it became fairly clear that people were simply jumping, that they'd lost hope and had chosen that way to go. And you could see these little sticks silhouetted against the blue sky, falling and tumbling through the air. And yet we still went closer, and we were going to the scene. And then, right before us, we were a few blocks away, and the second one did go. It collapsed, and a huge wall of caustic dust came towards us and came towards everybody. And everybody was turning and running. We were all backtracking as fast as we could as this mountainous wall of dust came at us. And the people who were running were of every nationality and creed and religion and age, and there were old people and young people, and there were people who looked Hispanic and people who looked white and people who looked black, and everybody was running from this wall of dust that was about to encompass them all. And we kept pushing forward, and we got to an area that had become a de facto staging area. There were a lot of firemen, a lot of emergency medical team, a lot of people just trying to help. And people were walking out at this point, and you would see businessmen that were dressed in their suits, beautiful black suits that were now white with this caustic dust. But by and large, the people were just dazed. People were just walking away from the scene with a dazed look on their face. We reached a point at which there was nobody left around. There was silence, and the dust had coated everything. The small trees by the roadway were covered in scraps of business papers that had blown out of the building, and dust, and random fires were set. There was one parking lot where the cars were on fire, and the cars were spreading. The fire was spreading from car to car. The tires would catch fire, and then they would burn the tire next to them, and then the engine would catch fire. And this fire was sort of spreading from one parked car to the next. Occasionally there would be a pop as the gas tank or somewhere would have some air would pop, but not exactly explode, but what pops. And this bright orange flames were burning against this sort of white-gray material. We walked closer, and finally we found ourselves into the area where the tower had first collapsed. We were very early on the scene. There were maybe 3 or 4 firemen there when we got there, and nobody knew what to do. And one fireman kind of took control of the scene and said, "We need to gather oxygen tanks for the rescue." So the fireman asked us, he said, "Would you help? Would you help gather some oxygen tanks?" And we said, "Well, yes, we would." And so we sort of set the cameras down, and we began to go into the fire trucks and pull out oxygen tanks and drag them to a large pile at the intersection. It was election day, and here was this poster talking about the local election and voting for a particular person. And I thought it was a crowning irony that this was election day, and in a free society, dealing with a terrorist attack of this magnitude. The magnitude of it, it was like walking into Hiroshima after a blast. I'm sure that everybody has said the same thing. The overwhelming magnitude was simply stunning. And there was a feeling of helplessness. We really couldn't do anything but just simply look and watch. And that is what I wanted to tell.